Technology is a very big part of the solution. So technology should, in Vietnam, not be expected only from other countries. Vietnam is growing and it is changing very, very fast. So therefore, Vietnam should think of itself as inventors of new technology and not only of bringing it from other countries. And this is ambitious, but quite realistic, according to many of us. And it is necessary for energy efficiency in production, in buildings, and also in homes. So I promised I would say a few things about what the UN is doing on climate change. I will say a few things about that in both the world and specifically in Vietnam. Because the climate is global, it's not national. Weather is local, climate is global, it connects. It's a typical UN question or issue. The UN is bringing together all the countries of the world under the so-called UNFCCC negotiations. The UN is taking initiatives in many countries on adaptation to the effects of climate change. And in Vietnam, we are working with, for example, Ministry of Agriculture on disaster risk reduction. In Vietnam, we are working with industry on improving the efficiency of energy use. Examples are investments in kilns in Bachan, where they use kilns to fire the pottery, but in more energy efficient ways. There are many examples of behavior change that we try to pursue by making people more aware, by writing, by making films, by putting things on TV, and maybe by talking to students like I do today. So the UN is trying to do a lot of things in Vietnam as well as in other countries. We have also supported the government of Vietnam in formulation of the main policy documents on climate change. The one key document is called the National Targeted Program to respond to climate change. And we helped the government to do that. We helped them in negotiating internationally Vietnam's position. And we help them at the community level as well. If there is time, I'll show you a 12-minute film, if there's time. I will check with the MC later whether there is time for that, but it's 13 or 14 minutes only. So there are many policy challenges in developed countries on climate change, and most of them relate to money and to technology for a country like Vietnam. Vietnam has people, it has capacities, it needs more capacities, and it needs more investments. And so to reduce emissions as well as to adapt to climate change, it needs money and technology. I've already mentioned the fact that the UN has supported Vietnam in formulating a national plan or targeted program. We do that in many countries. We help them with research, and we continue to do that in Vietnam. We are building capacities in ministries in some provinces. We are supporting that in localities, in local communities too. And we are developing ideas, innovative ideas as to how the government of Vietnam can perhaps change its taxation systems. So I want to put one question to you. Do you feel that a country like Vietnam should make petrol cheap for the consumer or expensive for the consumer? If it makes it expensive with a tax, the government takes that money. That money is a revenue for the government, and it means that it needs to raise less tax somewhere else. It takes, for example, less income tax. So if you make petrol expensive instead of cheap, then that hurts poor people who have a small motorbike. That's true. But it hurts them a little bit, and maybe they pay less somewhere else. And in fact, the government could use the revenue to make sure that that happens. If you make it cheap and you subsidize petrol, who do you subsidize? Do you subsidize the poor person with a Honda Cub, or do you subsidize the rich person with a Lexus? I think you're subsidizing the rich person with a Lexus more than the poor person with a Honda Cub. What is Vietnam doing today? Making it cheap or making it expensive? It is subsidizing petrol. So Vietnam is subsidizing the rich instead of taxing the rich. That's a very odd situation. It has many reasons. I am not saying you can change this very quickly, but it's, in the context of climate change, a very, very important topic. The main thing I've already said, dangerous climate change will happen unless much more action will take place. And this is where I started with sustainable development definition. I told you that I want to talk about sustainable development because of future generations in particular. But the causes of climate change and the lack of action globally shows that we are not caring about those future generations unless the global politicians change their action. We cannot conclude that they are looking after our children and grandchildren. The causes of climate change are often causes of other problems. I've given you one illustration. I said pollution of the big buses and trucks in Hanoi. If you take it away, actually you get global cooling. That's definitely true. But still, I would say pollution should reduce by having more efficient buses, because the effect of cooling is small and the effect on the local air is big. Hanoi would be much more pleasant to live in if the air would be cleaner. And so you can do something about global warming as well as clean air. It is a win-win situation. You have two benefits. Finally, every country in the world must play a role in sustainable development when we look at it from climate change. More than any environmental question, climate change is a global question. Any single country cannot win the battle. It has to be collective. So we are prisoner of each other in the world. This is my second question to you. No, this is not a question. This is a mind game. There are four possibilities. Four possibilities. One possibility, let's assume that dangerous climate change is really happening. Let's assume that. Let's assume that I am right and the worst comes to pass. But we spend about 1 to 2% of the global gross domestic product. That's a lot of money but it's only 1 or 2% of what the world has. Then scientists know that we will mitigate causes and effects, we will generate economic activity, and we will save lives. This is great. So for 1 or 2%, we can solve the problem. Secondly, let's assume it's not true. Let's assume I'm wrong. Let's assume all the scientists in the world are wrong. Climate change is not true. But we still spend 1 or 2% of global GDP. What will happen? Well, we will generate some new and clean technologies. We will generate some employment. And we reduce the risks for climatic disasters that we already have, like typhoons in Vietnam happened before climate change happened. So we spend money, but we don't lose anything, right? The third possibility, like the first one, we say, it's real. We believe it is true. Dangerous climate change is real. However, we decide, unlike option number 1, we do nothing. What will happen then? That's a terrible scenario. We sit, we do nothing, but it's real. It's not something you want to think about. Millions or tens of millions of people will die. Or more. Wars are likely to happen. Number 4, dangerous climate change does not happen and we do nothing. Let's say that's the scenario. So what will happen then? Well, nothing. But your children, your grandchildren, my grandchildren, they will not be happy with us. They will say, you were fools. You took a huge risk with my life. And that's not acceptable. I do not respect my ancestors, is what they will say. That's not a very good scenario either. So if you put it like this, I believe we have no choice. And if you disagree with me, please tell me so. These pictures do not come across very well in the back of the room, I guess, but I wanted to show you a few pictures simply of Vietnam. You know, a bridge in the mountainous areas in Thanh Hoa collapsed. Children couldn't go to school. Was it climate change? We don't know. Was it climate? Sure. It was weather. It was a typhoon. Will it happen more often unless we take action? Sure. So the question whether that particular typhoon was climate change doesn't really matter. What matters is that these children couldn't go to school, and we must make sure that next time they can. In the Mekong Delta, I took these pictures in the year 2001. There were major river floods. These people were given 5 million dong to build a small house along a dike. She is ill, she can't work. He is not very well, but he goes out to work. He cannot read, she cannot read. The boy has only a few years at school, is now going to work with his father. The 2 children here are taken off school already. These people are amongst the poorest in the Mekong Delta, you can imagine. They were living on the dike for a few weeks during the floods of 2000, and then again in 2001 when the floods reoccurred in the Mekong Delta. So they are being helped by the government. And in a sense, they are a little bit lucky, but that's not a good life. Here you see the same situation, not the same family, in the Mekong Delta, where these people, their parents have left home during the floods in order to go fishing or find some sort of income. The children have to stay behind, not at school. They are just in the hut for the whole day. That little baby can't swim. What if it drops in the water? There is no parent to look after. A positive story, also in the Mekong Delta, is this boy. He was only 9 years old and helped officials and an international organization to understand the local area. And the decision following his suggestion was to build a high road at the back of the village, which became the primary escape route should the floods happen again. So they identified this road as the most important. Again, in the Mekong Delta, you may not know, or maybe you do, but in 1997 there was a very major typhoon that oddly hit Cà Mau. It hit the delta in the south of Vietnam. It's very unusual to have typhoons there. And so suddenly the Mekong Delta also had to prepare itself for typhoons. So this strange roof cannot blow off when there is a typhoon. It is built on higher land so that it is not affected by floods. So in other words, this is a school. It looks a bit funny, but it is proof. It can withstand the pressures that are coming with climate change. More storms, more floods. And so it shows you that by simply changing the types of construction, a lot of stuff is possible. And so this is my final slide then. The future generations, I really want to stress that, are extremely important. And not only in the future. The children are also important now. So when we look at disasters, we know that children are affected disproportionately. More often children die. In those two floods in 2000 and 2001, very large numbers of children died because of drowning in particular. Hospitals were not accessible at that time. So hospitals need to be built, as well as schools, in such a way that they can continue to function during disasters. Children, as I've shown you, can be communicators. So we need to take children seriously. Also, very small children, because they are sources of knowledge and they are part of the communities that need to respond. And then, of course, I've already made the point, they are the future. And so we must engage them at every step along the way. And finally, young people and future generations, but young people today are amongst the most important carriers of the message of sustainable development, of saying we have to go to a sustainable development path. So that was my presentation. Thank you very much.